the other realization for business executives should be, there's a price on carbon emissions that will be coming probably more broadly, globally, in the near future.
You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of subjects that matter most to business leaders. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this series. And in today's conversation, we'll discuss carbon removal, carbon sequestration, and direct air capture. What are these things and what do CEOs need to do and know about them? Joining me today is Alex Heil, the senior economist here at the Conference Board and an expert in all things carbon. Alex, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Steve. It's always a pleasure.
Alex, you've just written a new report, which I found to be fascinating, about carbon and all of these areas, which we're going to talk about. And, everybody talks about 2050, we're going to be living in a carbon-free environment, but there's a lot of work that needs to happen between now and 2050 if that's going to happen.
Oh yeah, no, that's very true. I think especially after the climate summit, COP28 at the end of last year, there's been a lot of attention given to carbon removal, how much that's going to be part of a strategy of decarbonizing the economy going forward. And that is probably true, but to be honest, I think the entire industry at this point is still in a phase of exploration, discovery, and really infancy.
And everything, when I talk to CEOs, what they talk about is, okay, we're cutting our carbon emissions. We're cutting this, and we're heading down towards net zero of 2050. You've got this transfer in energy production from, mostly hydrocarbon related to renewables and nuclear and all of that. But that's just the emissions. What you're talking about is something different.
Yeah, what I'm talking about is really, just to connect to the point on emissions, we really as a world, as a global society, have not yet reached peak emissions, greenhouse gas emissions.
We're not even there yet.
We're not even there yet. So I think the discussion really needs to be framed in light of the point that the peak is probably still a couple years out. And then if we want to go from there, which is by that point, 25, 26, 27, to 2050 to net zero, we need to reduce emissions, if we're just looking the emission sides, by roughly maybe 6% per year. That's a big decline in terms of getting to a no emission world by 2050. But there will always be sectors that are hard to address in that transition. And there are also historical emissions. Carbon stays in the atmosphere, CO2 stays in the atmosphere and is active as a global warming agent for up to 100 years. So we also need to think about, historical emissions, need to think about concentrations, and that's when carbon removal really plays a role.
So you said several things in there that are really important. I just want to hit. So first of all, we're not at peak yet. So we're still climbing. We're still emitting more every single year until we hit that peak. Even with all the stuff we've read in the newspapers, heard on everything that everybody's doing, we're still not there. And then you have to decline. And whether or not 2050 is reasonable depends on how fast these technologies emerge. You've written on that subject, how fast we transform our energy sector. But even so, you have all this residual CO2 that's still in the atmosphere. And so therefore, we also need to be thinking about not only how do we taper down on the emission side, but how do we take stuff out of the atmosphere? And that's this whole subject of this paper.
Yeah, that's the topic of this paper. And some of the dynamics are different in different countries. The U.S. has actually emissions in the U.S. have started to decline, probably not at the rate that we would need them to decline in order to reach net zero by 2050, but carbon removal is going to play an increasingly important role in all of this. And I think we need to differentiate between, some of these different terminologies. In doing the research for this paper, I discovered how immensely complicated and complex this topic really is. But if we want to just distill this to the main takeaways, you can either capture carbon emissions at the source which might be a power plant, an industrial site. Or, as has been covered in the media, you could essentially suck it out of the atmospheric air. So those are the two approaches. And then we have, as an industrial society, been using the former for decades. So for instance, there have been industrial sites or energy plants at which, not that many, but a few where carbon dioxide has been captured and then reutilized for other purposes. Enhanced oil recovery is one of them, to increase the yield from, let's say, an oil field. It's been injected into the ground. Now, that's not removing CO2, but that certainly has built expertise in that industry on how to capture some of the CO2. And then on the actual removal side, there's a lot of discussion when it comes to capturing CO2 directly from the air. There's a site that went live at the end of last year out in California, where carbon is now being captured directly from ambient air through a limestone type process. But the numbers for direct air capture are still so tiny. It's really just pilot projects at this point.
Okay, so you've got sort of three terms here which you've thrown out: carbon removal, direct air capture, and then the sequestration. Carbon removal and direct air capture are similar in the sense that you're trying to take it out of the atmosphere, one very close to the source, the other just straight out of the air. And then you've got the sequestration. What is that?
Well, it's really a question of what you do with it, right? So once you capture it from either directly the air or from an industrial or energy type process, what do you do with the CO2 that you now have, essentially in some form, either solidified or in liquid form? And then you need to store it somewhere after this, you've gone through this process, and that's when real challenges take place, because you need to find a storage site. The storage site might not be next to an industrial facility, might not even be next to a direct air capture facility. So storage, so the process of delivering the CO2 that you've captured either from the air or from an industrial process, and then through an additional, at times energy efficient, high intensity energy process, to the point where you can actually safely store it in the ground. That's a whole nother set of processes and challenges for the industry.
Yeah, and we need to make clear, you're not a scientist, I'm not a scientist.
Clearly not.
You're an economist, and you're coming at this from that perspective, which is great, because we, hopefully we'll get sort of a lay description here. But just tell us a little bit. So you capture this stuff, and you got to lock it up somewhere, and you got to lock it up forever. I mean, hopefully so it doesn't get back into the atmosphere. So what does it look like? I mean, you pull this stuff out of the air. What is it? You said liquid or solid. Is it?
Well, it becomes essentially it can in one form be a solid substance that is then stored somewhere. The facility in Iceland, if I'm not mistaken, that is currently capturing CO2 directly from the atmosphere, is using it's almost, imagine your soda stream carbonated water little machine you have, right? Exactly, appliance you have in your kitchen. It's essentially doing that, where it pumps that captured gas into a porous underground structure, which then retains it and basically keeps and binds the CO2 at depth in a rock formation. So there are a couple different ways to do this, and I think we really, and again, that's really on the engineering side of this, we need to figure out what's the way to do this in the most effective and efficient way.
Yeah. Now, when you're talking about nuclear, one of the big issue on nuclear is several. Safety is one, but then what do you do with the waste? Mm-hmm. And in that case, you've got NIMBY issues, not in my backyard, because you've got the volatility of the waste product as well as the security and all of that, and the whole Yucca Mountain thing and so forth. This is different in the sense that you don't have the same kind of security issues or volatility issues. So the NIMBY issues should be quite a bit less. There should be fewer of them than you were used to hearing about on the nuclear side.
I think that's true. I think you still have issues, when it comes to the construction and operationalization of pipeline infrastructure. So you really need to think about how to move captured CO2 to a final storage place. And in case you're doing that in, in the gas form, sorry, if you're using this as, if you're moving CO2 as a gas, essentially, then that happens to be more dense than ambient air. So if there was an accident where a large quantity was spilled, it stays on the ground. It would affect people if they're around and expose them
some safety
to
issues.
greater CO2 concentration. Now, I'm neither a medical professional nor an engineer, but certainly in doing some of the research, the safety are nowhere near as pronounced as they are for nuclear energy. That's certainly true. But I do think that there are some, also safety issues that should be considered in all of this.
Well, and then the question is who owns the facilities and who finances them and all of that. And, everybody assumes government will do that, but that's not necessarily what's happening.
No, I think there's a lot of questions about the incentives, the financial and economic incentives around this entire process. I mean, what would be a good incentive to push people, push industries, push companies towards capturing CO2 from their operations or making investments that would capture and store CO2 from the atmosphere. And in order to really create an incentive, there needs to be an opportunity cost. There needs to be, let's say, like in Europe, an emission trading system where an emitted ton of carbon carries a price that a business may have to pay if it chooses to emit a particular quantity. But on the other hand, then that would lead to a comparison between that price and how much it costs to actually sequester CO2 from a process. So it becomes this sort of marginal comparison between benefits and costs.
Now, CEOs are accustomed to dealing with carbon offsets where they go to the marketplace and they buy it. In other words, their plants, they're producing, maybe food or something, but there is some carbon emissions. They go buy offsets for that in order to hit carbon neutrality within their business model, but they're still emitting. And these offsets are somewhat questionable now. We're finding out that there are some offsets, but that marketplace is not necessarily sufficient.
No, I think that's true. The voluntary offset market has been really questioned in recent months and years. I think there's a lot of projects that have come under scrutiny in terms of how much CO2 is actually removed as part of either the energy project or the forestry project, whatever the focus of that incentive there might be. And in many cases, it's just not the case that carbon offsets would create additional, meaningful, permanent CO2 reductions that could then be counted towards other emissions from an industrial facility.
Yeah, I think this is important for CEOs to really understand because they think that they're okay. Everything's fine. I'm buying these offsets and fine. But these offsets are being sold by sometimes questionable companies, it's turning out. Some of them are reputable. I'm not trying to impugn the whole industry, but they've planted a forest somewhere and they've got trees growing and they're using that. They get some credit for that. Because someday at maturity, that forest that they're planting is going to pull out a lot of carbon dioxide, but it's not necessarily today. So, there's a lot that goes on here, and there's double counting and all of that. So I really think what struck me from reading your paper is, hey, this is really a bigger issue, and you can't just, as a CEO, just assume you can go to this market and everything's going to be fine. You really have to do something within your business in order to start taking carbon out of the atmosphere, and hence these other things need to be, the sequester. First of all, the removal and then the direct air capture and the sequestration becomes a big deal because we cannot get there without the advancement of these technologies.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think all the scenarios that now project out emissions and various type of climate scenarios from now to 2050 or 2100, it doesn't really matter who is the organization, who is the entity that produced these scenarios. In what is now seen as the most realistic, the most probable ones, they have, they incorporate a fair amount of carbon removal to the tune of probably several gigatons, million metric tons per year by 2050, and then certainly by 2100. And those are big numbers, especially compared to where we're currently at. Getting there in early 2024 to 2050 and 2100, that's going to require a massive step up of that industry in terms of what we're actually doing.
We're talking about carbon and how to get to net zero. We're going to take a short break and be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Alex Heil, Senior Economist here at the Conference Board, and we're talking about carbon removal, direct air capture, and sequestration. So, Alex, this technology is being developed. We've got some plants in process. We talked about one, for example, in Iceland, and there are others. But there is an energy demand just to run these facilities. Talk about that and also the cost of carbon capture.
Yeah, a lot of these processes, especially when we're talking about direct air capture, they are very energy intensive. So it takes a lot of energy to essentially process ambient air. And the simple reason there is that the concentration of CO2 in ambient air is much, much lower than it is from an industrial process, several hundred times lower, actually. So if we're thinking about just the volume of air that needs to be processed, that takes a lot of pumps, that takes a lot of equipment, that is highly energy intensive. The statistic that stuck with me was if I take a direct air capture facility in order to capture a ton of CO2 from the atmosphere and I run it on electricity that comes from a coal-fired power plant, I'm essentially emitting as much CO2 as I'm taking out of the air. So there's a real conundrum here that we need to make sure that some of these facilities are powered by renewable sources, because if they're not powered by renewable sources, you're essentially shooting yourself in the foot with this, and you're not achieving the goals that you're trying to achieve.
Or nuclear.
A low emission or no emission alternative.
That's this is a really big point, because we still have, in this country, 20% of the electricity being generated by coal, and what is it? It's over half, 2/3 by hydrocarbon.
Yeah, I think the coal share is probably slightly lower than that today, but it's certainly true that the fossil share is still significant for the grid in, let's say, the average grid mix in the United States. There are some countries worldwide. I think Germany just reported that their renewable electricity share in 2023 was slightly more than 50%, which is considerable, even though they had
big progress.
Yeah, big progress. They had a bad year for solar, but they had a very good year for hydro and a very good year for wind. But even so, I think going forward, I think the further adoption of renewables is going to be important, especially if those become the energy source for a lot of these capture and storage and removal facilities.
Yeah, and just share with us some general numbers on the cost to remove carbon.
Yeah, it's really hard to come up with a specific dollar figure. The ranges that are reported are relatively wide. If we're looking at carbon capture, sequestration, various different types, they vary between $50 a ton, $150, maybe $200 a ton. If we're talking about direct air capture, there are estimates that they are from $400 or $500 to up to $1,000 a ton. Orders of magnitude larger than what we're finding when it comes to one industrial plant capturing CO2 from the smokestack, for instance. The number that really always resonates with researchers, and that is the one that is goal for the industry, is $100 a ton. When it comes to direct air capture, that's the price goal that I think those facilities are thriving towards, and at this point in time, we are still pretty far away from that.
And this, how many tons need to come out?
Oh yeah, I mean, annual emissions for the world are about, 55 billion metric tons or gigatons, and
55 billion tons annually times $100, even $100 a ton is a lot of money.
Yeah, that's why I think, the way that one needs to think about carbon removal, it's not the strategy that would basically offset all emissions, but we really need to think about reducing emissions first and choosing processes that have lower emission intensity. And then for what's left, at some point, carbon removal, provides a successful strategy potentially. Just to come back to that number, I think it's always so staggering. Total emissions for the world, 55 billion or thereabouts. If we're looking at how much is carbon capture and utilization and either storage, that's probably around 45 million tons, million metric tons. So that's 0.1% of global emissions. And if we're then thinking about how much is actually captured just from the air, direct air capture, that's in the 1,000 tons.
So zero.
Yeah.
It rounds to zero.
Yeah. So I think the scale of all of this really needs to be kept in mind. And if that can't just be the only strategy,
right?
Because it's just, we won't get there with those kind of numbers.
Well, and with the current technology, which has been your point as well, which is the technologies both on the renewable side, so that the emissions come down, need to advance, and it needs to be basic R&D. You've talked about this in terms of miniaturization of solar. You've talked about this in terms of battery storage. That we need to get away from lithium and all these other things. Maybe sodium's the trick. Sodium batteries are the trick. But anyway, you need to get those technologies moving, but you're also saying on the same side, you need to be pulling the stuff out of the air, and those technologies need to be invested in, and the costs need to come down dramatically. But I think what I got from reading your paper that was just, that struck me is we're not going to get there with one or the other. It has to be a combination of all of these strategies.
I think that's true, and I think we need to think about this probabilistically, essentially. So what are the avenues that provide the most likely outcomes here and the most likely impacts? And I think realistically, that's probably addressing emissions first, and then thinking about some of the technologies, that are really still in their infancy, like direct air capture, as sort of secondary and tertiary strategies to get to the ultimate goal. And yes, it will require a lot more research and pilot projects and interest in that particular type of technology. And it's really a process of diversification, the way I think about this. We really need to think about what are the different strategies, the different technologies that exist. Let's not throw one out right away, especially, you mentioned nuclear. I think there's been sort of a different change in the mindset by many observers and industry analysts that basically said, look, this is a no emission, once it's in operation, form of energy that can provide a certain base load of power without any variability and any intermittency. So it's probably, from the operation of the grid and sort of satisfying electricity demand, not a bad way to approach this. And it's one of the pillars of having a sustainable energy system going forward.
Well, the other thing is, if you can, people are, protesting, the installation of LNG plants, natural gas plants. However, if you could replace all the coal-fired plants in the world, magically, with gas, you would drop in emissions, pretty dramatically just with that move. So we can't be purists in this. I think, we've got to be thinking about the transition states in, for the next 100 years, we've got limitations on technology before we get all the way to bright.
I think that's true, and I think the U.S. is a good example of where the substitution of one energy type for another has essentially is supporting what you're saying. So we have in the US, a lot of the coal inventory has come offline. It's no longer, cost competitive, if you will. So the share of electricity generated from coal continues to fall. Natural gas and renewables have taken over that share and been growing. And as a result of that, emissions in the US from the energy sector are down over the last 15 years fairly substantially, anywhere around 16, 17% or something like that. So I think that is meaningful. I think we need to think about going forward. It's now 2024. What are we locking ourselves in, right? These plants have 20, 30, 40-year life. Where are we going to be in 2050? What does that mean for emissions? And how do we actually do this in a smooth process? Because it is, as you said, it's a transition. It's not flipping a light switch and going from one world into the other from one day to the next. So we need to transition out of certain energy intensive uses and move towards more sustainable demand patterns.
Okay, well that, so now again, I'm a CEO of a company that's it's not an energy company. They all know what they're trying to do, and they're trying to affect this. But what do I do? I'm running, I said use the example of food, but I'm manufacturing something, I'm producing something, or maybe I just have an office. I mean, what should I be thinking here in terms of actionable steps?
I think different companies so far have chosen different paths. I think there's certainly, and you mentioned this before in our conversation, there's been the path of offsets that's now been replaced at least by, some of the technology firms or financial services firms by actually purchasing carbon removal services, essentially. I mean, that's still relatively small, but there are goals that have been articulated, basically say by a certain year in the future, companies are intending to offset their entire historical emissions. And you can't get there with offsets. You really actually have to think about what this means for, in most cases, direct air capture. So I think the other realization for business executives should be, there's a price on carbon emissions that will be coming probably more broadly, globally, in the near future. As of right now, 25% of global carbon emissions are captured by some sort of pricing scheme. May that be emissions trading, a carbon tax, a combination of the two, like in Europe. And I think that share is going to grow. So at some point, carbon emissions will come with an opportunity cost, at which point looking at carbon removal will not only make sense from a board strategy perspective, a consumer perspective, a communications perspective, and a sustainability perspective, but also from a business and economic perspective.
Okay, well, we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about the government, but clearly the government and public-private partnership here is so critically important. But the government plays a role in regulation and obviously the policy that they implement. They have to be careful though not to just do that willy-nilly, or else they could crater the economy. I mean, you could really do some damage here. So there really needs to be, they need to work hand in hand with the private sector.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. I think the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 has created greater financial incentives for some of the new technologies. And that is going in the right direction of incentivizing some of the research and development in that area. But I do think that we're not at the place yet where, when it comes to carbon removal, one particular strategy has sort of won out and we need to now throw everything at that particular strategy. But it's really, let's try to think about this in a more diversified way. There are different ways that you probably want to capture carbon from industrial processes and operations right now. There's a entirely different approach when we're talking about taking carbon out of the air. And I think we need to sort of, if government and industry can work together on working on some of these pilot projects, developing technologies to see what actually makes sense also from a cost effectiveness point of view, I think that's the right way forward.
Yeah, and funding. And the basic R&D cannot be afforded by any one given company or industry. It really needs, this is a place where their social good is at risk, and so therefore it's a logical place for government to play a role in the fundamental R&D.
Oh, absolutely. I think what we have so far is little specks of investment. I mean, they're still relatively small in the big scheme of things when compared to investments in, let's say, the energy system overall, and that really needs to be scaled up. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to envision how we can scale up carbon removal over the next generation.
Alex Heil, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in geopolitics, economics, public policy, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, with your friends, with everybody who cares about a carbon-free 2050. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.